Today I want to talk about citizen soldiers, and I'm also going to throw in what the military was like here in St. Genevieve, and a little bit about St. Louis, because we were kind of kindred towns. So the origin of the Milicians started way back in 1669. King Louis XIV ordered the inhabitants of Canada between the ages of 16 and 59 to be trained in the use of arms and rudimentary tactical training. They were to defend the village against foreign attacks by Native Americans and also British people. They ranged in size from 50 to 80 people. Each man was supposed to have a rifle, powder, and a ball, and be ready to go when the bell rang and they said, okay, so there's a problem. So these were really aligned along parishes because French Canada was Catholic. And so they would elect a captain, one of the more prominent people usually, and they would have lieutenants, sergeants, corporals, ensigns, and ordinary soldiers called fusiliers, or fusiliers. The captain was responsible for conducting any census of the area because both the French and the Spanish wanted to know how many people they were ruling. And when you get down here to what was called the Pays d'Illinois, the Illinois country, all of the land in the mid-Mississippi Valley from what was on the eastern side of the Mississippi and the western side of the Mississippi was called the Illinois country. And even after the British took over, this side was still called the Illinois country. The first mention we have in our area of a milice was in 1723. D'Artiquette, who was the Inspector General of Louisiana, came up, and he was at Kaskaskia, and he formed the first militia group. And a guy named Bordeaux, Jacques de Bordeaux, was the first captain of the milice there. They formed them also in Cahokia. So citizen soldiers in the mid-Mississippi Valley typically were come-as-you-are kind of soldiers. You know, they had everyday jobs, and when they were called to arms, they'd come with usually a hunting gun, a fusil de chasse. They didn't have the big 69 caliber Charlevilles, so it was their hunting gun. They would have a powder horn, typically two to three knives on them, tomahawk, farm-making tools, and their clothes were kind of pretty simple. They would have moccasins for footwear. Leggings or mitas to protect their legs. Sometimes they went in breechcloths. I've been ordered never to appear in breechcloth. A chemise is a shirt. Headscarf is a mouchoir. And they had all different colors of mouchoirs. You normally see that they thought they were blue because most of them were from Quebec. Now, at 1800, I found a guy, we have his business journal, he was selling 17 different colors of mouchoir, including one called mouchoir de Nîmes, which is from Nîmes, France, and that's where we get the word denim, denim. They might have a capo, which was a coat made out of a blanket, which would have a hood on it, a toque, which is kind of a woven cap, and sometimes they would wear a sash to hold things on. And those were very famous. They were made up in Canada. Different designs because they're about that thick, and they're woven by hand. It's called finger weaving, and you could have like over 100 different strands that you're moving to make these things. So that's what the citizen soldiers, and there's a lot of other stuff on there that we tend to carry or demonstrate when we're talking about the militia. So Nouvelle France went all the way up from Hudson Bay almost, all the way down to Louisiana, down to New Orleans. And by 1735, they did a census, and it kind of shows you what the population was here in this mid-Mississippi Valley, and mostly on the east side of the river. By 1722, they had started building a fort near here, just across the river, called Fort de Chartres. Actually, we're on our fourth Fort de Chartres. There were, I think, 3 wooden ones that deteriorated, and the last one was stone. Kaskaskia, just south of there, Cahokia, which is up by St. Louis, Philippe Renault was a French miner that came over in the 1720s, and he had a little concession just north of Fort de Chartres. And then we had some officers and 41 soldiers, and they were a little bit different. They actually had uniforms. My friend Marty back there's got a French Marine uniform. And then we had Jesuits. Actually, they had come down. The reason they came down here for two reasons. One, they wanted to convert the Native Americans to Catholic. The black robes, you hear about them. They were the Jesuits. And they also came down to get furs because those were really, really big around here. So they only had, in 1735, there were only 159 people here. And the soldiers, over on the left, you can see Fort de Chartres. It's been partially reconstructed. It was one of the largest forts in in what is now the United States. They didn't use hunting guns. They would have Charlevilles, 69 caliber. They weigh about between 11 and 12 pounds. And they would have specific uniforms, white and blue. And later on, we'd have Spanish uniforms, and it would be blue and white. So it's hard to tell the French from the Spanish. But again, they would have garters to protect their legs rather than matas. So when we first started as we were a part of Quebec administratively, and about in the 1720s we became under the administration of New Orleans. And so before that, we'd have to send people up to Quebec, and that's quite a way upriver. So when they went downriver, it would take about 3 weeks. When they came upriver, it would take 3 months because they'd have to pull it. Sometimes they could have sails. So this whole area was under a commander at Fort de Chartres, and then there would be these local posts like Cahokia, Kaskaskia, and eventually St. Genevieve. And each of those would have a commandant who was really just in charge of the military if they had soldiers there. And they didn't always have soldiers in all the little towns. So they would have a capitaine de milice, the milice captain. And the other powerful person would be the Catholic priest, the curé. So there was really kind of a triumvirate in town, the captain of the militia, the commandant, and the Catholic priest. And the other thing that they had was something called a notaire, and that was like a notary. That's where we get that word, and they would write down everything. And we are blessed for those notaires because we have deeds, we have estate inventories, things like that the notaires wrote down. When we saw a deed before the Americans came, it'd say what kind of house it was, how big it was, did it have floors, did it have a ceiling, did it have porches on it, how big was the corn crib, what kind of roof was on the corn crib. It's just marvelous stuff. Americans said the meets and bounds. That's all you got. The other one was the syndic, and so we had a little bit of democracy in the mid-Mississippi Valley. Syndics were elected. They could be elected to build roads. They could be elected to build the fence around the big field or La Grande Champ where they did the farming. So that was or if they were going to build a church, they would elect syndics. So that's kind of how the administrative structure went in the Illinois country. So when we talk about the Pas de Illinois around 1750, the first thing we ever have seen written about St. Genevieve is right down here, called the Saline, or La Saline Riviere. And it's a salt creek. There was springs, and even Joutel, who was LaSalle's second in command, talks about visiting our salt spring on his way back up from down south. And across the river, you would see the Kaskaskia village. A little bit further north is Fort de Chartres, and then St. Philippe, which was Renault's thing. And then if you go really up, it would be Cahokia. So the towns were founded. Cahokia is always considered the first town founded in 1699. Kaskaskia, actually the priest had come down before that and settled up in St. Louis. There's River de Pere. And if you know French, that means the River of the Fathers. So they were only there a couple of years, and then they moved down to Kaskaskia with a band of Illinois Indians. Fort de Chartres, first one 1720. Prairie du Rocher, which is a little town just east of Fort de Chartres, was 1722, and St. Philippe, which is no longer there really, was 1723. I mentioned that the French liked to do census stuff. They conducted them in 1726, 1735, and 1752. And this is the first one that we find St. Genevieve. You'll see signs around town, 1735. That's never really been proven exactly. We think that it's more like in the 1740s that the first people came over. Our earliest document is 1751 that we know about. There was a land grant by the Commandant of Fort de Chartres in the 1740s, but we're not sure of the date. But they had all of this on here, and the French were pretty good. They not only told you how many people, they said how many oxen do they have, how many horses, how many pigs, how much gunpowder they had, how many guns, fuzis. And so they would have men and then arms-bearing youths and volunteers, or like somebody would just work for somebody. But when I started looking at this, there was less than one rifle per person that could defend the town, and they all had about 0.6 of a pound of powder. So they didn't have a lot, because we were pretty much on the frontier. You had to either get goods from Canada or get goods from New Orleans as they came from France. But this was the first time that St. Genevieve appears on a census. And this is the part of St. Genevieve. There were 23 people in 1752, including 2 black enslaved persons. And there was 2 volunteers. And you can see that the men and of what we had here, it's interesting, only one guy had most of the guns. He had 5, and he had all the powder and all the ball.
He must have been a jar.
We believe this is a significance that he is the captain of the militia. We don't have a document quite this early that says he's captain of the militia. In our first marriage document, which I'll show you later, it says he's a former captain of the militia. So we know he was there. So, and here's the guy. His name was André de Guerre de la Rose. So the French were wonderful about having nicknames. And that's what DIT means, known as. And so André de Guerre is known as the Rose. So they had all kinds of them. La Chance, Sans Chagrin. And sometimes the family would be known by the first name, like de Guerre, and sometimes by La Rose. And sometimes the family would split. One would keep de Guerre, one would keep La Rose. And sometimes in documents they could be called either one, and they did it just to confuse future historians. I'm convinced of it. So this guy was André de Guerre. That's his wedding announcement in our church records. And it's the first one in 1759 when we became our own parish. So we weren't even, the parish was not called St. Genevieve originally, it was called St. Joachim. I'm not sure if I say that right in French, but St. Joachim is how we say it up north now. But in it was about 1767 that the church was actually called St. Genevieve, but the village always was St. Genevieve. This guy, André de Guerre, was born in Canada about 1692. In this area here, we talk about Creoles. And what a Creole meant here, it wasn't a racial thing. It was the fact that if you were born here of parents from either Canada or Africa or Europe, you were a Creole. So it's a little bit different than some of the things that have come later on when it was more of a racial thing. But so some of our earliest documents mention this guy, De La Rose. And so he was our first captain of the militia. But he lasted until about 5 years, and then in 1760 we see this guy, Francois Vallée, show up on the scene. Another guy from up near Quebec, Beauport, and he came down in the 1740s. He was a lead miner, he was a negociant, he was a voyageur. Voyageurs were the guys that rowed the boats. And he became pretty wealthy, and he ends up having the family which was the quintessential ruling family of St. Genevieve during the colonial years. If you see here, this is the only word he could write, was his last name. The Francois was written by his notaire, or his clerk, Francois Leclerc. So, but he would do pretty good. He would last for 23 years as captain of the militia. So, like if you go to our church up there, there's a plaque on the floor by the altar of St. Genevieve that says he was commandant. He was never commandant. People kind of confuse those roles at times, because sometimes we had one guy that was both, and sometimes we had two guys that made up that post. But he got a special title in 1777 called, or 1770 called La Particulière de Juge, and he would deal with a lot of civil matters, and this was really during the Spanish time. And as they mentioned this morning, talking about his son Charles, this Francois was the only one that ever had that title in St. Genevieve. Now they had other ones there. I think there were 9 of them total in the whole district of Louisiana, both lower and upper Louisiana. But Francois Vallée, and you see fake names on here. Carpentier, that was Henry Carpentier. He was like a lieutenant in the milice. Let's see who else in there. There's Charles Vallée, and you see FILS behind his name. That means son of Francois. So, important guy. So, what happened in 1763? The French lost the French and Indian War. They actually had known that it was going to happen a little bit before that with the fall of Montreal in 1760, the loss of Signal Hill in 1762. And so King Louis XV decides, hey, I don't want Britain to get all this land. So he does a deal with his cousin, King Charles III, I think, of Spain, and says, I'm going to give you all the land west of the Mississippi that France claims, and New Orleans. Very important. And this was happened in 1762, called the Treaty of Fontainebleau. And then there is the Treaty of Paris that happens in 1763. Now, the French and Indian War is called the French and Indian War in America. It's called the 7-Year War in France. And they didn't know, in Britain, they didn't know at that time, that until that treaty, that Spain had gotten all this property. And in it, the Spain did lose Florida, part of that. I was really amazed, if you go down to St. Francisville, Louisiana, that's Spanish territory. And you didn't think about that, even though it's on the east side of the Mississippi. The commandant over in Fort Deschartres, was a fort down on the Ohio called Fort Massac, and he ordered that 15 men and an officer be transported to St. Genevieve, and all the artillery, consisting of 5 pieces of cannon, 1 of 3 and 4 of 2 pounds, 80 cannonballs, and 19 grenades. So I think that's probably the first cannon that we end up with in the 1760s. So St. Genevieve's probably started in the late 1740s, and then in 1764, Pierre Chouteau and Auguste Chouteau and Pierre Leclerc found St. Louis, and they were a little more advantageous in terms of location. One, they're up on a hill, and St. Genevieve was down on the floodplain. Secondly, they were very close to the mouth of the Missouri River, which opened up the whole west, so they become very prominent in the fur trade. So the British, here it is, 1763, all the land east of the Mississippi becomes British, but the British don't come in 1763. It wasn't until about 1767, or 65, excuse me, in October, that Captain Thomas Sterling and his company of the 42nd Regiment of Foot took possession of the Fort Deschartres. And they wrote up a document called the Procès Verbal, and it listed everything at the fort. And it pots, pans, shutters. I mean, it's a really neat document to look at. So you can see at this point, all the land east of the Mississippi is called Virginia because it's British, and the land west of the Mississippi is now Spanish. Well, the Spanish were even slower than the British in taking over. They finally, in 1766, a year later, sent the first governor, Antonio de Ulloa, to take over down in Louisiana. Well, the French were kind of under the misinterpretation. Their king had told them, well, nothing's going to change. Well, the Spanish didn't agree with that, so there was an uprising. And they actually kicked the first Spanish governor out, and he went back to Havana. That didn't set too well with the Spanish king, and so in, well, excuse me, I'll go one before that. We got our first commandant at that time, a guy named Philippe de Rostel de Rocheblave, who would figure very prominently in the American Revolution of the West. He came from Quebec. He had been born in France in 1727, and he was assigned in 1766 to be the commandant of St. Genevieve. That Spanish governor described him as a special volunteer commandant at Misère. Well, today during the seminary, you heard that St. Louis was called Pancourt, which meant short of bread. Well, they called St. Genevieve Misère, misery. They called Kaskaskia Pilot, which meant lousy. And Carondelet later they called, what is it? Vide Push, which meant empty pockets. And I always say, now they got a boat up there, a gambling boat, there's still empty pockets in Carondelet. Well, later he's going to get demoted, and he's going to leave, and he's going to go to the British side of the river, to Kaskaskia. So Rocheblave just lasted until 1770, when the Spanish decided they're going to take control of the area. A little bit before that, the first Spanish census, remember there was only like 120 some people or 150 in the whole middle Mississippi Valley. By 1766, there were 547 people in St. Genevieve and 332 in St. Louis. One of the things that happened, there was the French that were on the other side of the river, they didn't like the British. They had been fighting them. They thought the British were rough, tumbly, fighting, liquor drinking. I think one guy called him a vagabond once, and some other names. But so some of those French started coming across the river, and they increased our population. St. Louis about that time had about 50 houses and did not have a fort or any barracks. They had one commandant, 2 lieutenants, a fort major, 1 sergeant, 1 corporal, and 20 men. So at that point in time, we were starting to get some military people from the Spanish side, not yet in St. Genevieve. So one of the things we had that the French gave us is we have a roster of what the militia was, who they were in St. Genevieve in 1766, and you can see good old Francois Valley Sr., Péramine Sr., was captain, and his Lieutenant Louis Lasource, the beginning, and Andre Deguire, and a guy named Guignon, and they had 92 riflemen in 1766. A lot of times you'll just see a name, not the whole name, not the first name, not the so it's a little difficult sometimes to identify some of these people. In the 1760s, though, that Ulloa, that Spanish governor, had sent in 1767 a guy named Francisco Riu to establish two forts at the St. Louis, one on the south bank, this is the Missouri River, and one was on the north bank. He actually only got the south fort built, and the other one was just a little small thing. But we actually have drawings of that fort, and it's kind of like what looked like Fort Deschartres, only much smaller, and they did have some cannons, and they had a bakehouse there that went into ruins and was a problem. So we talked about the commandant, we've talked about the captain of the militia, and so the third guy was the priest, and we had a series of Jesuits that served our parish, but one of the ones that was here twice was Pierre Gibault, who we talked about today and honored today. He was a missionary from Quebec. He went to the seminary up there, and he came down to the Illinois country, and his parish was big. St. Louis, Vincennes, Cahokia, St. Genevieve, and he'd have to come across the river in a canoe or something, and he was gone a lot of times from Kaskaskia, which didn't thrill his parishioners that he was gone, because I mean they couldn't have Sunday Mass or anything like that, or have baptisms or marriages, and while he was gone. He sometimes carried 2 pistols and a gun and a long gun. So he was very important as we talk today, because he would get involved with the capture of Vincennes. When George Rogers Clark captured Kaskaskia, he wanted to find out if the Vincennes people, the French up there, was going to side with the Americans. And so he sent Father Gibault and another guy that we talked about last year, Jean-Baptiste de Lafont, up to Vincennes to find the mood of the people. And they came back and said, oh, I think you should go attack. And then he does that famous march in the wintertime. I mentioned that the Spanish were a little slow to take control, but in 1770, they put an Irishman in charge. His name was O'Reilly. One of the things that was kind of interesting, one of our priests in the late 1790s was a guy named Jock Maxwell. He was an Irishman too. Well, the British had shut down all the seminaries in Ireland, so when guys wanted to be a priest, they went to Salamanca, Spain, and went to the seminary there. So that's why we started getting a few Irishmen here. But good old O'Reilly, you know, that we'd kicked the governor of the Spanish governor out. Well, he lined up all the guys that were involved in that coup and shot about 6 of them, sent some to Cuba, and that was the end of the rebellion by the French. And so he issues a document in February 1770. It's got like 32 clauses, and we have a copy of that. And in it, he names Francois Vallée again, captain of the militia, and La Particulière de Juge. And he also brings in a guy named Louis de Breuil de Villiers, who was a Spanish soldier, and he becomes St. Genevieve's commandant. Now, the Valleys by this time, Francois was pretty much in charge of the town, and Louis was not too dumb. He marries one of Francois's daughters. So, I mean, Francois probably told him what to do, and he probably did it, but he was probably one of the few non-St. Genevieve commandants that ever got along with the Valleys. And the only ones that got along with the Valleys were named Valley. So, a little bit different structure. During this time, we had the governor down in Louisiana. We would have a lieutenant governor up in St. Louis. St. Ange was one of the first, Dave Bellerive. And then in St. James, commandant, captain of the militia, the Catholic priest. We still had syndics. There was also a group called the Marguières, which were elected. They were the church wardens. They took care of the property, prepared the church, finances, that sort of thing. Well, the notaires kind of went away, unfortunately, so we had greffiers, or clerks, and we got our first surveyor. If you're from St. Louis, trying to think of the guy's name, but he sent up one of the famous surveyors that was here for years. So we have this militia, and they're the home guard, and really what they were supposed to do in those instructions that those 32 instructions, it said they were supposed to meet after church on Sundays and drill. So that's how they learned how to fight. After that, they'd go to a dance. They always had lots of dances here. In fact, one of Francisco Rui's lieutenants got in trouble because he came down to a dance in about 1768 and gave a rose and a doubloon to a lady down here. And he was supposed to be getting goods, flour, meat, and that sort of thing, but he was partying. What can I say about the French? Well, in 1773, there was a Métis, which meant a half-blood European Native American, that stole a enslaved Indian woman from Kaskaskia. And then later, they found her body by some hunters just south of here, and she had been shot in the breast. And they thought that this Métis Celadon was the one that was the one that happened there. So he sent Valley assembled his militia guys and sent them out to look for Celadon. Well, they never could find him, and they returned. And later, Celadon comes back to town, and he sneaks out with a woman, Mary Ann, from the widow Abishon's house. She left 2 kids, and she went with them. And so he sent people out again, never to find them. He'd hear reports that they're on the St. Francis or they're on Big River, that sort of thing. This whole case is meticulously noted in our French records. I mean, they go through the whole thing, witnesses, that sort of thing. And actually, there's been a movie made about this whole deal called Under These Same Stars. And so you can, I don't know if you can find that any place, but it's an interesting, we had local actors and that sort of thing and put it together. So in 1776, Louis Villard gets stationed down in lower Louisiana, and he's replaced by a guy named Silvio de Cardabona. And he would become famous because he's the one that's in charge of the St. Louis militia during the time of the Battle of Fort San Carlos. I put some of these documents in here because when you see a document either by Francois Vallée or Cardabona, it means in front of me, Francisco de Cardabona, big captain of the regiment of Louisiana, commandant civil and militaire, St. Genevieve, Illinois. Can't see that last word, but they go on and on about who they are before you ever get into what's going on in the document. But it's an interesting thing to look for it. He had an interesting signature. One of these things, this little squiggly thing, is called a paraph. And the French always did it with the last name. If you look at a British guy, it's after the first name. It'll be like Robert with a squiggly. So sometimes when you're really bored, you start looking at signatures. And I've done a lot of looking at signatures. He was one of the first outsiders. Louis Villard, kind of an outsider, but he marries into the family, so he's doing pretty good. This guy is different, and he kind of gets along with Francois Vallée. They had experienced some trouble from the Native Americans. Trying to think what's Donna? Lynn? What Indian tribe? Chickasaw. The Chickasaw killed 7 people from St. Genevieve. They were coming back from Mine Lamont, and they were ambushed by the Chickasaw. Most of the Native Americans we had here were Osage, and some across the river were Kaskaskia, Michigamia, and Peoria. But one of the people that got killed in that raid was Joseph Valley, the oldest son of Francois Valley. So there was, we would have trouble not so much with the Osage. They just like to steal our horses and our cattle, but the Chickasaws were a little more rebellious. So here's all of a sudden in 1776, we start seeing a couple of changes in the titles, like that Commandant Civil and Militaire. Before we would only see Commandant Militaire. So on July 4th, 1778, the American Revolution comes to the Illinois country. George Rogers Clark comes to Kaskaskia. The soldiers are having a dance. Roche Blob is in bed with his wife, and George Rogers Clark comes in and wakes him up and says, "You're our prisoner." And so then there was, the French there were really concerned about what was going to happen, and George Rogers Clark convinced them that the state of Virginia was going to let them do their religious beliefs, and that kind of settled them down. And Father Gibault, their priest, helped settle them down, and so that was the most important first battle. It wasn't really a battle. I think they got it without a shot because they snuck up on them, and the French were probably drinking wine or something, and Rocheblav sleeping, so that kind of got that. So then when, as we talked about before, George Rogers Clark, he also went up to capture Cahokia, but he wanted to capture Vincennes. So he sent Jean-Baptiste Delafonte and Gibault up there to ascertain the mood of the French. And so, that's when we usually give a lot of credit to Gibault on that, but from the readings, this Jean-Baptiste Delafonte, who was a doctor, born down in the islands, the Caribbean islands, got a lot of credit from Clark for his work up at Vincennes. And so Clark recruits people. He had brought Virginians with him, but he recruits people from Kaskaskia to go to Vincennes with him, and that's some of the people that we honor here went to Vincennes with Clark and then moved across the river and are buried here. Because finally the French got tired of the British and didn't think the Americans were much better because most of them came from Kentucky or Virginia and liked liquor and fights and that sort of thing. But that Rocheblav, he gets captured, he gets sent back to Virginia as a prisoner. They parole him, and he escapes to Canada, to Quebec, and ends up becoming a politician up there, and that's where he ended up dying. So the next census we have is 1779, and we have one in November of 1779. And again, it's starting to look at St. Louis and St. Genevieve. And you can see this is just prior to that battle up in St. Louis at Fort San Carlos. St. Louis had increased from 118 to 226 fighting men. St. Genevieve only had increased from 162 to 165. St. Louis had a military contingent. Ours here was very small, 7 or 8 soldiers and a commandant. You can also see that the total number of enslaved people was much greater in St. Genevieve because we were an agricultural community. St. Louis was interested in getting furs, and they didn't grow food very well. That's why we call them short of bread, and we'd have to send bread up there. But St. Genevieve, with our what we call La Grande Champ, our big field, it was, people, I think I looked at one time, 60% of the people that lived here of households didn't have enslaved people. Some had quite a few, like Francois Valley might have had 50 or 60. But a lot of people worked alongside of their slaves down in the, if they had 1 or 2 down in the big field, because the crop was all important. We look at the St. Louis Milice in 1779. They had 148 infantry, and for the first time they formed a cavalry unit. And it's the first time that we know that they were issued uniforms. And so that you see that thing on the left with the red uniform. And unfortunately, during the Battle of Fort San Carlos, the cavalry wasn't. They were shooting down in the trenches with the other guys. There's a lot of controversy of whether anybody else got uniforms up in St. Louis, but we have no record here of a militia unit being issued uniforms. Now, up in Canada, sometimes they did. especially if they were going out during the winter. So one of the things we can tell from the 1779 listing, as you can see on the left, that the great majority were from Canada. So they were still French Canadians. But then you had the ones born in Pays de Illinois, the Creoles, 43. But we had all of a sudden we're starting to see some true French people here. We didn't see that in the early days other than priests and that sort of thing, or soldiers. Even one from Acadia. But it also lists all the what their occupations were, and you can see that should be a boatman. I listed it as a boatman, but that's really a voyageur, somebody that would row a canoe or pull a bateau. And the same kind of thing happens in St. Genevieve, but you can see not many of them were farmers, comparatively so. And they had coopers, shoemakers, a tailor, a musician even. And they did have a baker up there, I believe, that the town baker. We didn't have that here in St. Genevieve. So this is the St. Genevieve Milice. This is on the left is a copy of the actual document that's in Seville, Spain, in the Spanish archives. And it again starts out showing who the officers were and tells where they came from and what their occupation is. And we have about 175 people in the militia in November of 1779, about 6 months before the Battle of Fort San Carlos. And again, a lot of them are from Canada, but then we're starting to see almost an equal amount of people born in the Illinois country, the Creoles. And I think there's one from New Orleans, and I think that four from Germany. We were one of them was a guy named Franz Kuhlmann, but the French called him Francois Coman. All the Colemans of old mines are descended from this guy, and thank God he was a brewer. So they had beer here for a lot of years. One from Spain, I think, was from the Canary Islands. But you see those ones called Angleterre? That means English land. And so that was people that had come from across the river and had joined our militia. Now, you had to profess to be Catholic to come across the river, to immigrate to Spanish Louisiana. I think we got immigration laws now. They had them back then. But again, a lot of boatmen, a lot more farmers here. It was almost equal. Those day laborers would work in the field too. Some of the people that were in charge, and we see these names a lot. These are over in Kaskaskia. So this is about the same time. This is all under George Rogers Clark. And you can see a few names in there that don't look American. They look French. And so he was assigning people. One of those of the first company, Nicolas Jeanny de la Chance, actually is buried in our cemetery, and we honored him last year. So he was one of those guys that fought for George Rogers Clark but came across the river. Baptiste Charleville was another one that came over. The Barbeaus, they married well. There were 5 daughters in that family, and they all married well. So in May 1780, just 6 months after that November census, Lieutenant Governor de Leyba in St. Louis gets word that there's going to be an attack by a large Native American force with some British regulars, a few, and some French Canadians. So he writes a letter to not only Francois Vallée, but to Cardabona, Silvio de Cardabona, that says, okay, come to St. Louis to help defend St. Louis, because it was a strategic spot with the Missouri River being right there. And he said, okay, bring 60 men, put them in a bateau, have them come with 24 days of rations. And I guess Cardabona and Charles Vallée was in charge of the militia. His father was too sick. Francois was too sick at the time, so he sends his 2 eldest sons that he has left, Francois and Charles, and he keeps his youngest son, who was a cadet at the time, Jean-Baptiste Vallée, who we'll talk about later. But they ended up got up there within 4 days. And, they were also come with 2 swivel guns that were mounted on their bateaus. There was a road that was between St. Louis and St. Genevieve in 1779, but that must have been just a footpath. So it was quicker for them to go by boat with all their supplies than it was to horseback. Or the French weren't big on horses per se, other than for horse racing. They didn't use them that way. But so this call to arms, and so Francois Valley says, okay, here you 60 guys, you're going to St. Louis. You're going to take your gun, you're going to take your powder, and you're going to go up there and help defend St. Louis. So the Battle of Fort San Carlos is, we know how big St. Louis is now. It happened all right downtown. I think excuse me. So they're protected by the river on the east, a little bit on the north. So they built a big trench that kind of went all the way around. And they built a tower, which you can see kind of over there. DeLeyva was not popular because he made him go dig this ditch and build that tower. But on the morning of May 26th, there were a number of people out in the fields, out in the area picking strawberries. And the Native Americans attacked, and some of them didn't make it back to the fort. But between the militia of St. Louis, the soldiers of St. Louis, I think there were 5 or 6 soldiers from St. Genevieve that went up with Cordobona. They helped fight off this Native American attack, and that's the Battle of Fort San Carlos. Altogether, there were 29 Spanish regulars, 281 militiamen that defended St. Louis. 20 of the St. Genevieve militia guarded the government house, which is here, and that's where the women were all located. Those Frenchmen always like to go where the women are, so. But they get accused later of not participating in the fight and all that. So there's always 2 sides of the story. There were Sauk, Sioux, Fox, and Menominee tribes, and so they manned that big ditch and also that tower firing cannons. There were various casualties of the thing. There were 21 killed, 14 whites, and 7 enslaved, 6 wounded, and 25 people captured. This would be the first time that St. Genevieve lost a citizen soldier. There was a guy named Saint Jean, and he was either killed or captured and never heard of again. There was a St. John in the St. Louis militia, so we're not sure if he was captured or he was killed, but he was a casualty of war. DeLeyva said, "The enemy attacked like madmen with unbelievable boldness and fury, making terrible cries, and that they massacred persons in the fields who had not had sufficient time to take refuge. It was an affliction to see these poor corpses cut to pieces, their entrails thrown out, their limbs, heads, arms, and legs scattered over the field. What a horrible spectacle." I guess war was pretty brutal back then, too. So after the war, there was some people, again, that didn't like DeLeyva, and he actually died a few days after the battle. He had been sick during it, and a lot of controversy came about later. They said bad things about DeLeyva. They said bad things about the St. Genevieve people, that they spiked their guns and wouldn't fire them and all that. There's a wonderful counter argument about all that in something called The Spanish in the Mississippi Valley by Francis McDermott, and it's called The Imbecile Governor, and it's worth a great read because it takes the side of DeLeyva and kind of works through that and all what happened.
What was the title again?
Pardon?
What was the title again?
It's called, it's a chapter, The Myth of the Imbecile Governor, in a book called The Spanish in the Mississippi Valley, 1762 to 1804. So There's several other chapters in there, but this is a very interesting. They even wrote a poem about how bad the labor was. A lawyer later in the 1830s published this poem, and they really didn't like him too much. But the Spanish king, the Spanish governor liked what de Leyva did. He liked what the Valleys and the St. Genevieve militia did. He promoted Valley to, I think, a captain in the regular army with half pay, and his sons were given accolades. Cardabona got a promotion. So, I mean, they were just glad that they had beat off the French. And, you know, the British had attacked Cahokia at the same time, and that's where George Rogers Clark was. But he and de Leyva had worked together to defend St. Louis. So one of the important documents that we have is, who were these 60 guys that went to St. Louis to defend it from the St. Genevieve militia? Well, there's two documents they're called the AGI Cuba documents in Seville, Spain, and this is the roster of July 5th, 1780, and there's another one, August 5th, 1780. So these are the guys from St. Genevieve that are still in St. Louis after the battle. And what's really tough is they are spelled phonetically in Spanish, and sometimes change and using Spanish names instead of French names, equivalent French names. But we try to, this is the list that we look at to see if we can identify people still buried in St. Genevieve that were at the Battle of St. Louis. Some of them are very difficult, we'll never get it. Most of these guys, if you read Carl Eckert's book, Colonial St. Genevieve, he says they were voyageurs because it was spring planting time, and what's more important is having people that are going to work the farms and plant the seeds. So he would send the voyageurs, and unfortunately those guys get buried all over the place. They could get killed in the woods, or they moved away, or whatever. So we've been studying this list, or have been studying it, trying to find more people that participated in the battle up there that we can honor in future years. So this kind of ended St. Genevieve's involvement in the Revolutionary War. It was just kind of a short period there, 1778 with George Rogers Clark, and then the battle at Fort San Carlos. In 1783, Francois Valley, who had been ill during the battle, dies. And his son, Charles, is named captain of the militia. Unfortunately, Charles couldn't fill his father's shoes. He became a womanizer, a drinker. He began destroying his marriage, and as a result, his wife filed for divorce. And I got to tell you, you don't file for divorce in the Catholic Church in 1783 or 84. And it was a big, drawn-out battle. She never got divorced. She couldn't get the kids. The other Valleys kind of took them under care. But his reputation was in shambles, and so Charles left and went down to Opelousas, Louisiana, where he's buried. He was honored today because of his time at the Battle of Fort San Carlos. He's not a SAR or DAR person that's buried here, but he was an important individual. So we also have a new commandant, a guy named Antonio de Oro, who is a Spanish guy, and he didn't get along with the Valleys. This was a continual fight. De Oro hated St. Genevieve. In fact, one time he wrote the Spanish governor down in New Orleans. He was really irritated because somebody had put a cartoon on the church door. Now, all the notices were put on the church door. And this one was a cartoon that his wife wore the pants in his family, and it really irritated him. So he's going to get replaced by a guy named Henry Pierre de Coudrenier, but he gets sick, and he dies in the town that he hated, and got buried under the pew of the church. Now, at this time, when he's dying, the town was actually about 2 miles southeast of here, right on the river. And they had had all these floods and everything. In 1785, it flooded up to the top of the roof of the houses, and they started moving up here to St. Genevieve between 1785 and 1794. So at that point, Charles Valley's out, Antonio de Oro is gone, died, and this Henry Perot comes in, and he is now this commandant civil and militaire. And so he's kind of running everything. He can still have a captain of the militia, but this is the important guy that rules on cases that come before, like litigation and that sort of thing. Henry Perot, when they started thinking about moving the town, he wanted it to move down by La Saline, the Saline Creek. He owned land down there. But the Spanish governor sided with the valleys, and they moved up here to what we call La Petite Côte, the little hills. Actually, there's three hills. The littlest one is where I live on, and it can get flooded, and there's a big flood. Then you got the middle one where the church is and the cemetery, and then you've got one up higher. But like I said, the Spanish governor decided, well, they're going to move to St. Genevieve. So they didn't move the Spanish soldiers until 1793, and they didn't move the church until 1794. The Spanish lieutenant governor said, you're going to tear down the old one, you're going to build a new wooden church up here. That's actually our third church in the new town. There was a stone church built in the 1830s, and then in the late 1870s, they built that brick church around the stone church. You can actually see the foundation underneath the stone church, or the brick church. But Perot kind of irritated the lieutenant governor. So he takes off for a year, and he goes to Philadelphia and tries to recruit people to come settle in our area. And that's about when they were having all that, people were coming from France because of the revolution. They were trying to settle outside of Philadelphia, a place, it was called Gallipoli, and it was a land swindle. When they got here, they didn't own the land, and so he was trying to get those people to come to St. Genevieve. He wasn't very successful, but when he got back, the valleys had already gotten in good with the lieutenant governor, so they figured out a way. They were going to get rid of him, so they sent him down to New Madrid to be the commandant down there. And who did they put in charge? But another valley, Francois Jr. He's got one of the neatest paraphs that we have. I've studied when he was a child to when he became, this is elderly and white. That little thing in front with the 3 dots, took me a long time. I kept seeing that. That means he was a witness to this document. And again, he has a very fancy title, Commandant Civil and Militaire of the Post of St. Genevieve and of New Bourbon and its dependencies. So what's going on with this about this time? You know, 1794, we were starting to have some Native American trouble with the Osage. The Osage didn't get along with the Spanish like they got along with the French, because they were trading partners with the French. But New Bourbon, about 1793, just before Francois Valley takes over, another guy hits town, and his name is Pierre-Charles de Delessus de Louzière. He was a royalist. He worked for King Louis the 15th, I guess. He held several titles over in France. He was a commissioner in the Navy and that sort of thing. And he was a Chevalier of the Grand Cross of the Royal Order of St. Michael, Commandant Civil and Militaire of the Post of Nouvelle Bourbon and its dependencies. So what's New Bourbon, Nouvelle Bourbon? This guy, he got caught up in that Gallipoli land swindle and stuff. He came over from France. He brought his harp with him, 2 or 3 servants, lots of baggage. And he's written about his journey with his family coming back to St. Genevieve. But he happens to know the lieutenant governor, or the governor down in Louisiana was a guy named Carondelet. And they had met in France. They were from the same area of northwest France up near Belgium. And he convinces Carondelet to let him have his own district. So they carve it out of valleys. It's just like 3 miles south of here. He gets New Bourbon, which was a little town. He gets the Saline. He gets an area called Beau Brulee, or Burnt Woods, which the Americans called Bob Brule because they couldn't pronounce the French. But he seemed to get along with the valleys. So this is kind of this is a 1793 map. So down here you have the old town. Remember, it didn't finish moving until 1794, 1795. And then this is the road up to the new town. And this is where New Bourbon, or Nouvelle Bourbon, is. And it was called several names: Calvary, it was called Generous Mountain, but eventually just Nouvelle Bourbon. These people were royalists. They didn't believe in this French Revolution stuff. You know, it was the king. When the king's son was born, it was a big deal here. So there was actually a law passed in Louisiana that you could not support the French Revolution. So these guys you can see the big field where they did all the crops and the long lots in this map. So around 1794, there was a thing called the Genet conspiracy, where they were trying France to come back and take over what was Spanish. And they decided to build a fort here. And this fort was up on the hill. We actually have a 1797 map that shows it. You can see a little cross right there. It says wooden fort. It only lasted about 4 years, and then it kind of deteriorated. They'd build these things with posts in the ground, and they'd start rotting and that sort of thing. And the soldiers never lived there. Valley would rent them out some building or something, and that's where the soldiers lived. But at this point in time, since Delassus de Louzière had his own little district, they started to have two St. Genevieve militia groups, one in St. Genevieve, and Francois Valley Jr. was the captain, and one of his sons was the second lieutenant. You got to keep this money and the stuff in the family. And down at New Bourbon, it was the youngest Valley, Jean-Baptiste, and one of André de Gare's sons, and another family, Jean-Baptiste Johnny, this family came over after the Revolution in the late 1780s to St. Genevieve. So we finally get the last deployment in what I call the Colonial period, which is before 1804, and this was late in 1802, 1803. There had been a Mascoutin Indian down in New Madrid that had killed a white guy, trying to think, his name was David Trotter, and they killed him and burned his house. He had sold some bad whiskey to the Native Americans. So they were going to have this big trial, and the lieutenant governor, whose name was Carlos Delassus de Louzière, decided he wanted to make an example of the Mascoutins. So he decides to send a bunch of militia down there. So he sent them from Platten Creek, which is just up north of here, St. Genevieve, Cape Girardeau, and they went down to New Madrid. And this is in late December. And soldiers never like to go out when the weather's bad. And St. Genevieve soldiers really didn't like to go out in late December because the time between Christmas and New Year's was the season of St. Genevieve. It's called Le Temps de Fête, the time of festivities. So they get down there, and they actually end up convicting this Mascoutin Indian, and he's hung. The New Madrid Commandant wrote that the St. Genevieve soldiers have got to send them home. All they're doing is drinking all the time. So after the first of the year, they finally get sent back to party in St. Genevieve. So the last deployment of the St. Genevieve militia. So you know that in 1800 there was another secret treaty, the Third Treaty of Il Defenso, when all the land that belonged to Spain went back to France. But the French, like the Spanish before them, didn't take over control. It wasn't until, I'm trying to think, it was like August or September that the document between the Spanish and French were signed, And it was in December, about December 21st, that the takeover of the Americans from the Spanish happened down in New Orleans. We think that that's the official time when all of the Louisiana Purchase became American. So eventually they decide, well, they got to get up here to the we were called Upper Louisiana. I tell my friends down in New Orleans and Louisiana that we're Louisianans up here sometimes. And so on March 10th, 1804, it's known as Three Flags Day in St. Louis. On one day, they took the Spanish flag down, raised the French flag, and the next day they did March 10th, they raised the American flag. And Amos Stoddard then appointed Jean-Baptiste Vallée, that last militia captain for New Bourbon, as the militia captain of St. Genevieve. But take that back. He was listed as commandant, not captain of the militia. Vallée didn't know any difference, so he kept being captain of the militia. And there were a bunch of Americans over in a valley about 40 miles from here said, we ain't listening to any darn French guy. We're going to do our own thing. So, but eventually they came around. But the Valleys were always good about getting in with the powers that be. And Vallée writes this, we are now all American, and as such I will devote myself to my country's service and to the welfare of my fellow citizens as I have done under all other governments. And now we're out of the colonial period. We still had a militia that happened until I think about the 1820s. Some suggested reading. My Bible of Colonial St. Genevieve is the one on the left. Carl Eckert's written a number of books. You can read about Delassus de Louzière. It's called a French Aristocrat in the American West. Stealing Indian Women is about that Celadon affair. Several books on the bottom have been written by Stephen Kling and about the American Revolutionary War in the West. And a friend of mine from Spain has done some work on those militia members in St. Genevieve and St. Louis between 1779 and 1785. So good reading. It's a fascinating area to do research. We also have this St. Genevieve militia. It's a group we get together. We have ladies in the militia. We have children that come, and we have several events during the year. Some encampments. We participate in like jour de fête, go around firing weapons and teaching people. We've even had a junior militia start teaching kids about some of our history. And so you can kind of follow us on Facebook. There'll be some pictures from the day on there eventually. So I thank you for attending. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. Thank you all for coming down to Visit St. Genevieve. Come back again. If you look at visitstgen.com, we have lots of events during the year. We got a French festival coming up in June 8th and 9th, something like that. And Jour de Fête's the second full weekend of August.